also want to thank all of you with whom I've interacted these last couple of months. Well, I'm only here another month, but it's been such a great pleasure to be a part of this community. I have had a long-standing interest in African contributions to the environmental history of the Americas. And my first book, Black Rice, explained the history of African, the second rice species, in the Americas, with an emphasis on the role of enslaved Africans, rice growers, for its New World beginnings. And my second book, In the Shadow of Slavery, examined the significance of tropical African food crops in shaping the foodways of plantation societies. And this book drew attention to the role of food grown in Africa for provisioning slave ships and slave agency in establishing familiar dietary staples on their food plates. The current book project, if I was here, focuses then on the human environmental history of Atlantic Basin mangroves, from the period of transatlantic slavery to the present era. And what I want to start with is contrast of two perspectives that we can identify in terms of looking at this ecosystem. One is mangroves as places inhospitable to human life, and the other is mangroves as places of refuge. So taking the first one, mangroves as places inhospitable to human life, this view is actually entrenched in the Western imaginary of mangroves. It developed from the high mortality rates that Europeans experienced in the ecosystem during the period of slavery. I argue that... Okay, so mangroves as places inhospitable to human life, that's one of the perceptions I'm talking about, and the second, mangroves as places of refuge. So the first view, mangroves as places inhospitable to human life, is entrenched in the Western imaginary of mangroves. It developed from the high mortality rates Europeans experienced in the ecosystem during the period of slavery. I argue this perception, thank you, continues to influence contemporary Western approaches to the ecosystem, which is now a conservation priority. So in sharp contrast to this is in sharp contrast to the historical experience of Africans and those of the diaspora, for whom mangroves have long served as food forests and places of refuge. Mangroves are actually a significant wetland environment that abetted the black struggle for freedom throughout the Atlantic world. So Europeans first came across the mangrove ecosystem when mariners reached the coast of Senegal in the 1440s. This was an unfamiliar forest located at the continent's edge where land meets sea. A landscape submerged for part of each day. Low tides expose the aerial crop roots that anchor the trees in the mud below. So to seafarers, the vegetation presented an impenetrable tangle of thickets with clouds of biting insects. And the Portuguese had no word to describe this new vegetation to them. So the mariners borrowed the local African name, mangi, from the Senegambian Wolof language. And in this way, mangi entered Portuguese for the vegetation, becoming mangle in Spanish and mangrove in English. During the transatlantic slave trade, European ship crews feared mangrove swamps as a white man's graveyard. Deadly fevers cut them down, and an 18th century sea shanty warned mariners of its perils. Beware and take care of the bite of the knee, for few come out, though many go in. Mosquito-vectored yellow fever and falciparum malaria were leading killers of Europeans in tropical Africa. But only at the end of the 19th century did Western science formally identify the lethal cerebral form of malaria and its Anopheles mosquito vector. Before then, Europeans attributed these deadly fevers to the miasmic air of the swamp. Africans alone carry genetic resistance in the form of the sickle cell trait. During the Atlantic slavery period, Europeans perceived mangroves as pestilential and mortiferous places. But for Africans, the mangrove was anything but a landscape of fear. It served as a refuge, an environment where they might elude slave traders, and as a reliable source of food. In tropical America, mangroves also held a lure for Africans enslaved on coastal plantations. Runaway slaves at times achieved self-liberation in these swamps, as evidenced by the number of fugitive maroon communities found along Brazil's mangrove coast. Colombia's mangrove-forested Pacific lowlands similarly attracted escaped slaves whose descendants inhabit the region to this day. Mangroves were more than hidden refugia for runaway slaves. They are also significant food forests, as these contemporary images from West Africa illustrate. Mangroves provide vital protein through fish and shellfish, firewood and salt for cooking, and organic soils amenable to what James C. Scott calls escape agriculture, where rice, the African oil palm, and vegetables readily grow. Today, the Western imaginary of mangroves has profoundly changed. No longer a pestilential habitat, they are viewed as repositories of biodiversity and havens for many threatened species. Mangroves are at the forefront of scientific concern with climate change and biodiversity loss. They protect coasts from sea level rise and act as a reservoir for carbon sequestration. 3/4 of the world's pelagic fish spawn in mangroves, as do many endangered marine species. And mangroves are globally significant flyways for migrating birds. But in just the past 30 years, mangrove forests have lost 20% of their global surface area, from conversion to shrimp farms, road building, coastal development, oil spills, and to some extent firewood markets. So this is behind the current conservation emphasis on mangrove protection, as we see in this image, slide of the national parks and marine protected areas in just West Africa. Across tropical Africa and Latin America, such conservation measures, ironically, often result in the expulsion of one species, humans, with long-standing historical ties to the ecosystem. The contemporary view of mangroves as biodiversity Eden leaves unchanged the misleading Western imaginary of an ecosystem that is unsuited to human habitation and should be empty of its human denizens. By considering mangroves as a peopled habitat, I seek to restore the ecosystem's human history by calling attention to mangroves as racialized landscapes of the tropical Atlantic world, shaped by nearly 400 years of Atlantic slavery. The human history of these mangroves is actually even older. Extensive shell middens on both sides of the Atlantic testify to an ecosystem that has been continuously inhabited for at least 3,000 years. Shell middens also attest to the importance of mangrove shellfish in the diet of coastal populations. But when we consider the food resources of mangrove swamps, we can see gendered patterns of ecosystem use that contain deep historical linkages via the transatlantic slave trade between West African and diasporic mangrove societies. So what my approach does, in effect, is to call attention to a socio-ecosystem of peoples, plants, animals, soils, and tides that shape geography and survival at the margins of the African diaspora. I suggest that an environment Europeans long feared as an incubator of deadly fever abetted African survival during nearly 4 centuries of slavery and after. Part of my approach is to compare contemporary shellfish collection practices in West Africa, Brazil, and along Colombia's Pacific coast. This is a framing that underscores the significance of mangrove resources for Africans and their diasporic descendants. So what this research does is it considers how Africans across the Atlantic world shaped and reestablished place-based knowledge in an environment marginal to European territorializing and hegemony. Situated between land and sea, the in-betweenness of that mangrove swamp enabled a distinctive sense of place for diasporic people who found themselves in between 2 continents, 2 worlds, and 2 social states, free and enslaved. I trace these relationships through examining the shellfish species harvested in West African mangroves. Shellfish collection across the Atlantic world is performed by women. The first part of this project involved field work to identify about a dozen species consumed for food in West Africa and the microenvironments along a mangrove waterscape where women collect each species. This provided a baseline for comparison with diasporic mangrove areas. During the transatlantic slave trade, European seafarers were astonished to discover oysters growing on the prop roots of mangroves. This is the first known image of a West African mangrove oyster, Crassistrea gassar. The West African oyster clings to the aerial roots of the Rhizophora or red mangrove, the pioneering coastline species. The West African oyster was established in Brazilian mangroves during the transatlantic slave trade. Its distribution is shown on the map here on the left, where it coexists with Brazil's native oyster, Crassistrea rhizophorae. And for the Americans in the audience, these are cousins to the Virginia oyster, the famed Crassistrea virginicus. Recent genomic research indicates the African oyster likely crossed the Atlantic during the transatlantic slave trade, perhaps by oyster larvae affixing to the wooden hulls of slave ships. Note the spatial concentration of the African oyster along Brazil's Pará, Maranhão coastline, lower Amazon. During the 18th century, the Portuguese directly imported from the region of Guinea-Bissau nearly 70,000 enslaved Africans. Frequent slave voyages between these 2 Atlantic areas gave the African oyster multiple opportunities to establish itself on the other side of the Atlantic. But the region's mangroves also beckoned those fleeing slavery, who sought self-liberation in a food-forest environment Europeans avoided. And the map on the right shows the mangrove and rainforest areas where they fled. It also locates documented maroon communities known in Brazil as quilombos in 18th century Maranhão and Pará. And in this satellite image, from the coast of Bahia, Brazil, geographer Case Watkins also shows the relationship of documented quilombos to coastal mangrove forests. The foundation then for this comparative study on the mangrove ecosystem as an inhabited food forest is based on field work I've been conducting over the past 25 years in Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and in Brazil. For in West Africa, I should say, the gendered patterns of ecosystem evidence are quite evident. Men fish in the mangrove waterways, while women and children collect shellfish. Oysters are the most common shellfish species collected. Women paddle dugout canoes to mangrove mudflats at low tide when the oysters and other items are exposed, and return with the rising tide. Shellfish collection requires an astute temporal spatial understanding of tidal flows, wetland ecology, knowledge of productive harvesting sites, and preservation methods. This image shows two other important dietary shellfish, the cockle and the whelk. And the next slide has several of the sea snails, land and aquatic crabs, and the periwinkle. The importance of shellfish in West Africa, the species collected, and women's role in harvesting raises the question, do diasporic mangrove areas across the Atlantic world involve the same genera and evince a similar collection pattern? More than 2 million hectares of coastal South America are covered by mangroves. Half are found along Brazil's coastline. Colombia's Pacific coast represents another major area of concentration, around 370,000 hectares. The Brazilian and Colombian mangrove forests are inhabited by Afro-descendant populations, many who trace their beginnings to ancestors who fled slavery. Early observers of coastal Brazil, coastal Bahia, repeatedly described shellfish as the slave's favored food. One 16th century account claimed crabs were, quote, the sustenance of all this land, particularly of the Guinea slaves and Indians, unquote. These shellfish remain important sources of dietary protein to coastal populations. Writing in 1587, one Bahian planter described oysters so thickly encrusted on mangrove prop roots that they, quote, never deplete, because when removed, others are soon born in their places, unquote. Shellfish collection was also, of course, important to native peoples. In Bahia, shellfish gathering, fishing, and hunting were actually men's work. Amerindian women did most of the farming. But these gendered Amerindian resource management practices faded with the collapse of indigenous populations and their replacement by enslaved Africans. Diasporic mangrove communities in Brazil today, as in West Africa, view shellfish collection as predominantly female work. So could an African and gendered pattern have influenced the way that Afro-Brazilian males and females currently describe their work in mangroves? Even when men and women work side by side gathering shellfish and other seafood, a woman refers to her work as mariscagem, from mariscos, or shellfish. A man to his as pescaria, or fishing, from peixe, or fish. A similar gendered pattern is decidedly evident along the Pacific lowlands of Colombia, where the region's mangrove forest, high rainfall regime, more than 7,000 millimeters, and daily tides as much as 4 meters, once made the inaccessible coast a haven for runaway slaves. In these lowlands, shellfish collection also follows the West African pattern. Afro-Colombian females collect oysters, crabs, and a type of clam or cockle known as piangua from mangrove mudflats at low tide. And today, cockles are an economically important regional seafood marketed by women. Shellfish middens dating to pre-Columbian times indicate that cockles were once an important dietary protein of Amerindian populations in this mangrove region of Colombia's Pacific coast. However, today, in the absence of Amerindian communities, they are only collected by the region's Afro-descendant populations. What might explain this? This returns us to another organism of New World mangrove ecosystems. Falciparum malaria arrived in tropical America along with enslaved Africans. This deadly plasmodium, vectored by Anopheles mosquitoes, likely abetted diasporic occupation of New World mangrove swamps. Africans and their descendants alone had genetic resistance to this introduced malaria strain. Native peoples, as with Europeans, were, for the most part, immunologically defenseless. Did then an ecosystem that sheltered runaway slaves and repulsed Europeans also prove to be an incubator of Amerindian mortality? Today, the region's remaining Amerindian communities are located far upstream and north of the mangrove forest, near the headwaters of rivers that drain the Andes. Falciparum malaria also remains an endemic health issue along Colombia's coastal lowlands. So in conclusion, by drawing attention to the metabolism of the mangrove ecosystem during the era of Atlantic slavery, my aim is to consider how New World Africans, along with other non-human organisms, microbes, insects, shellfish, fish, and amphibious plants, carved a habitable space in an environment otherwise avoided by Europeans until into the 20th century. A lethal form of malaria to which Africans alone were resistant served as microbial ally in the centuries-long struggle of the enslaved for survival, autonomy, and freedom. In these dynamic aquatic spaces of tropical America, New World Africans and their descendants shaped the food forests of mangrove swamplands into distinctive biocultural communities where Black lives, in fact, did indeed truly matter. Thank you.